So when we were coming up with the idea for this conversation, we both knew immediately that we wanted to talk about this idea of resisting dystopia, both in the real world context, but also in fiction. And so I want to start by asking you about what do you think dystopia is, and what does it mean to be resisting it? Like, what is this thing that we're talking about that we want to push back on?
So the very easy question of how to define dystopia. Dystopia is a world that is fundamentally broken. It is a world in which compassion is thin on the ground. It's a world in which no one wants to live, and in fact, it's quite difficult to do so. It's a place in which survival is the only end that you really have the ability to fight for. Resisting it does not mean we're just going to tell a story about somewhere else. We're just going to close our eyes and stick our fingers in our ears and focus on, the most rose-colored glasses version of this instead. Resistance is action. Resistance is struggle. Resistance is a fight. So if you are going to resist dystopia, resist oppression, resist fascism, any of these things that are very much part of the world as we live in now, it requires effort and it requires honesty and a lot of other traits that we're going to talk about in the next 58 minutes or so.
I wanted to add to that one of the things about dystopia is that it is a real world phenomenon. It's something that we associate with fascism and oppression and closed regimes, but it's also a type of storytelling. And, as science fiction writers, we are immersed in a world where people often tell us that dystopian writing is the most realistic kind of writing. And that if we want to tell a story that is going to help our readers, our audiences grapple with what's going on in the real world, we need to tell them a dark, fucked up story where everyone dies and the world is ashes at the end. I once went to a hacker conference where people were talking a lot about the grim meat hook future. And that's basically, I think held up as this ideal in narrative. And so I think part of resisting dystopia isn't just the hard work of politically resisting in the real world, but also resisting the urge to turn our stories about the future into these very one-note, non-nuanced visions of where humanity and our world could go. So that's another piece of what we're resisting in our work, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, the real world and fiction go hand in hand. They are an Ouroboros. I have a real bone to pick with this thing that is very common in the here and now, and not just in science fiction and fantasy, but in storytelling as a whole right now. This idea that cynicism equals sophistication, right? That if we're going to tell stories to adults for adults, that it has to be the grim meat hook future. That this is inevitable somehow. I think that is just profoundly wrong. It's profoundly wrong on every level, because you're creating this self-fulfilling prophecy. You're saying that hope is something that belongs to children, that joy is something that belongs to children. And if that's the case, what are we fighting for? Like, what's the point? I really think that just breeds nihilism. If the only stories we are telling about the future, even if it is in a fictional context, if the only places we are imagining and escaping to are places in which the grimmest possibility is the only outcome, what do we have to hope for? What do we have to live for? And so that's where I think, I'm biased, of course, but why I think it's important, not to say that those kinds of stories don't have value. Sometimes in order to confront things that are horrifying, things that are real and scary and damaging, we do need to lean in to that. You just need to sometimes grab it by the collar and look at it in the face as hard as you can. But if you don't have a counterpoint to that, I think it just starts to poison you after a while, which is, sugar does too. If all you had was if all you had was hopeful stories, if all you had was and everything works out and they all lived happily ever after, that's not going to help you out either. But I think, you know, the basis of a nutritious fictional meal is to have I didn't mean to keep continuing with this metaphor, but here we are. But you know, to have a healthy, balanced ecosystem of storytelling, you've got to have the other side as well.
Yeah, I'm still really disappointed about the whole thing where you can't just eat sugar all the time. So, you know, thanks for bringing it down. But I think, I mean, to continue with what Becky's saying, I think what's really important, I think for both of us in our fiction, is avoiding a binary where there's either dystopia or utopia, because I think that's the other trap that we get into as storytellers, not just as fictional storytellers, but also as people who are trying to innovate or people who are trying to, you know, write nonfiction about the future, is that we're sort of told, okay, it's either going to be all sugar or it's just going to be this realistic, grim future. And the fact is that the future is going to be just as messy and nuanced as the present. You know, there's going to be people doing really cool stuff. There's going to be people trying to kill the people who are doing the cool stuff. And there's going to be everything in between, right? There's going to be mixed spaces where lots of those people come together. And so I often tell people that I'm a topian writer, which means I'm just writing about a place like now. And, you know, one of the things about dystopian writing, and for a minute I want to pick on a specific example because a lot of people have been revisiting The Handmaid's Tale for obvious reasons, not just the television show, but also real world politics. And one of the things that Margaret Atwood has said about that book is that she sees it as realistic because every single thing in it has happened at some point in history, which is actually unrealistic because there's no point in history when every single bad thing ever happened all at once. And this is not to pick on that book. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It's an incredibly useful allegory for us to think about what's happening to women's bodies and women's rights. But in terms of what dystopia is, it reminds us that dystopia is an allegory. You know, it's just a fantasy or a fable. It's not an actual real world scenario.